You've had an answer. I'm going to mute myself now, Nancy, so we don't get any...
Okay. Okay, so someone is interested in reasonable adjustments for clients. That's useful because I think it's when people are starting work, very often they don't know what's available. And what I found is when people understand what reasonable adjustments are available, it makes them have a lot less fear about going into a new role. So that's something that is useful. Is anybody looking at reasonable adjustments for colleagues or for self? Clients and colleagues, okay, great. So if you're a line manager, then knowing about reasonable adjustments is very useful. And just for clients from C. Binsley. Hello, C. Binsley. Okay, well, that's useful to know. I'm also interested to know if you are, what kind of disabilities that you're working with. The disabilities tend to fall into kind of three main categories, well, four main categories really, which would be musculoskeletal, sensory impairment, and mental health, and then sort of neurodiversity. And that is the sort of main categories in which we think of reasonable adjustments, and there's a lot of overlap between those, but they are all slightly different. So does anyone have a particular interest in any one type, or is everybody interested in all? All interested in all? Okay. Oh, I like that response. We are a supportive business and we help people with in-work support and a transition into unsupported employment. We help people with all disabilities. Awesome. I'm really glad that you're on this webinar. And mental health for 80%, that's interesting. There's okay, so what I'm going to do is start by giving you an overview of the kind of legal, the legal position of reasonable adjustments. And then as we go into this webinar, one of the things we can talk about is the difference between reasonable adjustments for visible disabilities and non-visible, because it is quite different. So let's get going. All righty. So, my name is Dr. Nancy Doyle. I'm an occupational psychologist and I also run Genius Within. And I've been working in the area of reasonable adjustments since about 2002, when I started working for Access to Work. One of the jobs that I had was to go and visit people in the workplace and do a workplace needs assessment and help them work out which adjustments would be suitable for them in their disability. And that is something that Genius Within does. So Genius Within is a social enterprise covering the whole of the UK. We provide workplace needs assessments, not via Access to Work anymore, independently. We also provide adjustments that Access to Work have commissioned, and we work closely with occupational health and HR, and we advise on systemic inclusion as well as individual level inclusion. And one of the things what I'm going to do today is talk with you about definitions, legalities, inclusion practice, and then what would be quite nice is if we go into quite a lot of detailed specifics. But those have to come from you rather than me. Okay, so this slide that I'm showing you at the moment, my concentric rings, the legal status of disabilities, disability adjustments. So we have at the very heart, in the very center, we have this idea of person-environment fit. So any job performance is based on the idea of the skills, experience, training, personality of the person, and the demands of the environment that they are fitting into. And with disability in the workplace, what we sometimes have is a mismatch between the person and the environment, a way in which those two things are not working together. And so at the very micro level, whenever we do workplace needs assessments and try and work out what adjustments could be, we might have to come back to this very, very individual level where we're looking at the person in the environment that they're going into or that they're already in, and think about how that environment is going to best fit them or not. The next level up is the Meso Level, and this is the interaction between that person and the wider organisation that they're in. And then we have the macro level, which is the wider idea of industry and the norms of the workplace, and how we expect people to behave in the workplace. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting about the disability legislation is that it talks about the adjustments that an organisation must make, not that an individual must make. So we're not expecting the person to change to fit their environment, we're expecting the environment to fit the person. And how much the environment has to compromise, the word used is reasonable adjustments. So there's a sense that, it might be that the environment can't shift enough to accommodate this particular person with their particular issues. But the legal status of reasonable adjustments is it's something that a workplace must do differently to accommodate an individual, as opposed to a change that an individual must make in order to be better at their job. And I think that's really worth just remembering that, because a lot of reasonable adjustments are applied at the individual level. And when it comes to hidden disabilities like mental health and neurodiversity, and also the cognitive effects, the thinking impact that long-term pain or discomfort has on people, we expect individuals to get better at coping with those things. And we talk about coping strategies, as opposed to we expect the environment to change in order to make those things less of an issue. And so, sort of speaking quite broadly, thinking about the macro level, there are lots of things that we consider normal that don't suit people with disabilities. So thinking about workplace HR and communication norms. So for example, rush hour travelling is a particular difficulty for people with mobility issues, with autism, and with social anxiety. Do we need people to stick to workplace to fixed hours? Do we need people to travel in rush hour? Do we need people to come into the office at all? That's one place we can start, is by thinking about the norms of what we're expecting everybody to do, and does that actually predict job performance? In human resources and recruitment processes, again, there are lots of norms, like the fact that we use interviews as the most sort of ubiquitous form of recruitment, but actually there are lots of jobs where face-to-face communication isn't part of the job. So if you are hiring somebody to be a plasterer or a data analyst, actually it's not a very effective measure of their job performance, giving them an interview. But these are sort of big macro level norms that are quite exclusive for people with some disabilities, that mean that they're not even getting into work in the first place, as well we all know. I'm sure people on this webinar are very well aware of that. But it's always worth just thinking about those norms, because if we can educate our employers and our colleagues to really question those from the start, then that's a positive place to be in. The second level is this sort of workflow and immediate environment. So what tools are available to the person in their workplace? What method of communication is kind of normal for the way they go about being assigned tasks, reporting on what they've done that week, what's in their environment, what kind of desk space do they have? Do they have a computer? Is that computer set up for that person? Is it going to compromise them? So, for example, there we might be talking about the height of a screen. If you have back pain, we might be talking about the level of noise in your background environment. If you have any kind of concentration, memory, pain management, or neurodiverse issues, the open plan office is one of the worst places that you can be for job performance. And that's before we even get to that micro level of thinking about who is this person and do they fit this job. And I think, you know, the most important thing to remember with reasonable adjustments is that what we are doing is putting them in place to release the individual to be good at their job. So we always have to start with what is the actual job that this person is being invited to do or required to do. If the job is plastering, then that's what we have to think about. If the job is data analytics, then that's what we have to think about. There's lots of, well, you know, this person wants to put on earphones and block out the background noise, but that's not a very team-spirited thing to do, and we like to have communication with the team. Well, you might like that, but if it makes that person able to focus on the data and do an accurate job of data analytics, then that's important. However, in a plastering situation, it might be more difficult because there's a health and safety issue. So it's always very nuanced, and we're always thinking about kind of what's the balance between what an employer has to do to shift and what that individual can manage. Does that make sense so far? So there are lots of occasions where a reasonable adjustment for one person doesn't work for another. And that example I just gave you of being in an open plan office but versus being on site doing plastering, the person might have the same problem, which is being distracted by background noise, but the adjustment is appropriate for one and not for the other, unless that plasterer is working on their own and they're the only person in that environment and they're not likely to need to be alert to other noises around them because of a health and safety issue. So it's got to be thought about on that person individual level, but the elements of things that we're going to change and the activities that we do to make the adjustments have to come from the environment and the employer. All righty. And so it's also worth just thinking about what we are trying to get at here. So when we are talking about it's a fine balance, and I think I'm quite privileged to work in a lot of different markets. So social inclusion is one of the things that I do at Genius Within, but I also do a lot of work with leadership training, human resources, various things like that. And I am very aware at the moment that disability inclusion is becoming part of the talent management agenda. So lots of employers and very senior employers are talking about the wasted talent that is out there in our potential employee pool of people with disabilities who are missing out on employment, but organisations agree that they are missing out on talent. I went to a meeting with the International Labour Organization in Washington, DC about a year and a half ago, and they were talking about the disability employment gap there, and the CEO of Tommy Hilfiger was there. The CIO of Boeing was there. You know, there was some serious, I mean, I understand that they were probably posturing a little bit, but the fact that they were sending those senior executives to this meeting to talk about disability exclusion was really interesting to me. And particularly, I think it was AT&T were there as well, which are a big telecoms company based in the States. And they were talking about call centers in India, where they were deliberately recruiting people with visual impairments because what they found is that their hearing was enhanced and they did a better job of managing the calls accurately and quickly because their hearing was so enhanced, mainly due to the fact that their vision was impaired. And so, you know, the fact that these stories are out there really lets me know that there is will at the senior levels in organisations to include people with disabilities. However, what there is this kind of very practical barrier. Managers don't know how, so they know they have to. They know that there's laws, which means they have to change. They know they want to because there's potentially talented people who could be really good at the job but aren't getting there for whatever reason. But they don't know how to. They don't know what those reasonable adjustments are. So that's hopefully some things that in your line of work you can give them advice on, and we can start smoothing that gap, and that's certainly my mission. Okay, so let's look very practically at reasonable adjustments. So this slide, and these slides will be available afterwards, these slides are the main categories of reasonable adjustments. And what I'd like to do is talk through each one very briefly and then stop and have questions from everybody around, examples of particular problems that you might have. So assistive technology. A good thing to do with assistive technology is to play with it. There is so much out there. The main forms of assistive technology are speech to text and text to speech. And so this is really reducing literacy barriers, not only for people with dyslexia, but also for people with musculoskeletal difficulties that might mean they have difficulty with typing. So typing is an issue for lots of people, and the assistive technology programs out there have got really good. When I first got into this field about 20 years ago, they were diabolical, and it used to take you so long to program them to understand your own voice that it wasn't really worth it. But in the last few years, they've got really good, and I think that's partly because the technology is becoming more ubiquitous. So in most iPhones now, you've got voice recognition software, and so the actual dedicated programs have really raised their game hugely. And I have it on good authority from one of my coaches that the assistive technology speech to text programs can now even understand and decode a Glaswegian accent. So totally winning. But speech to text technology is revolutionary for lots of people. I worked with somebody who had chronic arthritis in both hands, and he had been a youth worker. And he hadn't worked for 5 years because his pain was so bad. And he had simply he'd never seen the assistive technology. He didn't know it existed. So in his role as a youth worker, he didn't need to use his hands, talking to people, running groups. This is all good. But his issue was writing up reports at the end of the day, and how painful and difficult it was for him to do that had just started to put him off the whole idea of working in his chosen field. And so he was looking for alternative roles, and he couldn't find anything that didn't involve reading and writing. But when we showed him assistive technology, he suddenly went, oh my goodness, I can go back to work. And it really is that good. And so what I would recommend that you do is invite one of the assistive technology companies that are out there to come and show you all the things that are available. And most assistive technology is accessible via Access to Work. So when people go into work, they can put in an Access to Work claim, and they can get that assistive technology put in place as well. I mean, there are all sorts of things, like there's programs that you can attach to any software or any database that will speak out loud anything that your cursor highlights, so that if you're visually impaired, your computer just starts talking to you and telling you where the email button is and where the send button is and the compose button is. So you can learn the layout, but it will also just tell you what you're highlighting. Assistive technology, it's so advanced, and it's getting more and more so. In the last 2 to 3 years, it's jumped again, and it just keeps doing that. And there's lots of disability advocacy groups based around assistive technology that are really saying that because the advances are making it so that almost no person with a disability is going to be disadvantaged from the workplace within a couple of years due to this sort of barrier. It's just not going to be an issue anymore. So I won't talk in quite as much detail about everything, but that one I think is really worth exploring. It's absolutely vital for anyone with literacy difficulties, absolutely vital for sensory impairment, and absolutely vital for anybody struggling with fine motor control. You can even get special mouse that has an easy grip. There are just special pens that have an easy grip. There are so many things like that out there. The best thing to do is to invite one of the assistive technology companies to come and give you a demonstration. I do think we might have an assistive technology company represented on the... Anna, are you here? Because I know Anna from Microlink was thinking about coming, and Microlink are one of the best companies for looking at reasonable adjustments. They have a bus which has got all of the assistive technology kitted up, and you can just go in and have a play with it. So let's move on to workstation adaptations. So that might be ergonomic chairs. It might be having a dual computer screen to allow you to have more open, which improves concentration and reduces the load on memory, which is really important for neurodiversity, also really important for mental health, also really important for anyone managing chronic pain. So yeah, dual screens, ergonomic chairs, and distractions in the environment. So if you're in the middle of an open plan office, we call that 365 degrees of distraction. If you're in the corner of an open plan office, we call that 90 degrees of distraction. And that shift can make a big difference in how productive someone is and how accurate their work is. If you can't move that person, what else could you do to buffer the sound? You could wear headphones, you could book out a meeting room if you had to do a weekly report that was particularly difficult. You could say, well, actually, I can't do that in the office. I need to be in a quiet space for that. And you can, move that person as well as allowing that person to move so that they can work where they're most productive. I do a lot of work in medical fields, and for paramedics, there is very often, that where are you going to write up the notes of your last shout? And so just sort of walking around the space that they've got and finding the quietest corners where they can sit with their back to the wall, where they're not going to get distracted by something from coming behind them, allows them to focus on writing the notes more easily. So thinking about the sensory element of workstation adaptations is really important. I think some of the physical needs that you might have if you needed wheelchair access, or if you had a particular musculoskeletal issue, some of those things are quite obvious, but the workstation adaptations also really, really play to people with mental health needs and neurodiversity. Okay, coaching falls into two categories. So when you're making adjustments, you can be looking at coaching around executive functions. Executive functions, by that I'm talking about memory, concentration, time management. And as I've already alluded to, that affects people with neurodiversity, mental health needs, and anyone with chronic pain or discomfort. So that might be multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue syndrome, return to work from cancer, various things that are going to affect your executive functions. And so we can provide specific coaching on strategies to manage executive work functions in the workplace, and that is a standard reasonable adjustment which is paid for by Access to Work at the moment for people with those conditions. For dyslexia particularly, there's additionally sometimes people have literacy coaching, but this is less prevalent, to be honest. The majority of people with dyslexia that come through Genius Within, which is about 1,500 people a year, the majority of them are getting executive functions coaching. That's sort of 92% are getting that, versus 67% are also getting literacy coaching. But we'll come back to coaching because it's particularly interesting as an adjustment, because it's not the organisation changing, it's the individual being expected to change. So I will come back and talk about that in a minute. So the next one is schedule flexibility, and I've already alluded to that with the idea that travelling during rush hour is sometimes a really useful thing that an employer can do to be flexible with their schedule. That just makes a huge difference. I don't know if anybody saw Employable Me this time last year, but there was one particular individual who had cerebral palsy, and it was taking her 2.5 hours to get to work. And so by the time she actually got to work, she was so tired that she couldn't concentrate. And that level of discomfort is going to put anybody off being able to perform their role. And so if she had had some flexibility in maybe being able to work from home 2 or 3 days a week, so that she only had to make that journey when she absolutely had to, that would have been a really good example of schedule flexibility. I also have a colleague who is very autistic and has huge social anxiety and OCD. And that individual finds rush hour physically uncomfortable and panic-inducing. And so the idea of getting on the tube in that rush hour is really difficult. She has, not turned up for events and things that would have been very fun for her because she couldn't manage the journey at those times. And so I think we can encourage employers to really think about schedule flexibility. What could we do instead? Does it have to be Monday to Friday 9 to 5? Could it be 7 till 3? Could it be 10 till 6:30? Could it be only 2 days a week and not 3? What does the business actually need? What does the job role actually need? Does the job role actually need Monday to Friday 9 to 5? Does it? Really ask that question. Another way you can provide reasonable adjustments is with the supervisor input. So what a supervisor might do on a day-to-day basis might not be adequate for somebody with a disability. And so what we might find is that the supervisors need to, for example, provide regular specific feedback. This is particularly important for mental health and neurodiversity. So people with neurodiverse conditions are more likely to misinterpret an instruction and go off and do the wrong thing until they've got into the rhythm. People with mental health needs are more likely to need reassurance and feedback and supervision to let them know that they're on track, and more likely to become anxious if there's a miscommunication. And as a really good example of this, I have a very senior employee who I know has difficulty with mental health, has a history of mental health, ill health, and has had long periods without work due to her mental health. And one of the things that I observed about a year ago is that this individual was being very frosty in meetings and was being quite defensive and really kind of, the defensiveness was starting to get looks from other people. And I was like, oh, okay, this needs a conversation. So I had a conversation with her, which took about an hour and a half. And it was quite a long, detailed conversation. And it turns out that this all went back to an event in a previous meeting where I had said something and she had misunderstood what I meant and had thought that I was questioning whether or not she should be in her job. And so because she had that as her frame, oh, Nancy thinks that I shouldn't be here, I have to constantly defend myself. And, she had compensated for that by being too forceful and too aggressive. So we had this conversation and we unpicked it all, and it took me an hour and a half. And I started thinking about reasonable adjustments, and I started thinking, is that a reasonable adjustment? So if I have an employee with a mental health need, is it reasonable to expect me to spend an hour and a half debriefing miscommunications, paranoia, anxiety? And then I thought, all right, put this into another perspective. If you had an employee with a visual impairment or who was in a wheelchair, would you bat an eyelid about spending an hour and a half helping that individual work out how to move around the office, helping that individual work out how to get to a specific event that you really wanted them to attend, how to, no, you wouldn't, Nancy, you wouldn't think twice about it. And so therefore, the reasonable adjustment for mental health was that added investment that I gave that individual of giving her the benefit of the doubt, of thinking about what she needed. And sorry, Rogers, there's a chap called David Hawley who can't hear anything. Could you perhaps get in touch with him directly, and then I won't lose my flow. Sorry, David. I hope it's sorted soon.
Yeah, will do.
Thanks, Rog. So I think the issue there is it's more nuanced, isn't it? How do we advise that? How do we say to employers, with mental health, sometimes you need to just take extra time to help this person work out whether they're valued, work out whether what they're doing is correct. But the quid pro quo is, what did I get back from that? What I have is an intensely loyal colleague who is absolutely fantastic at her job. And if all I have to do is every 6 months or every 3 months or even once a month, spend additional time helping her work out what her value is and reassuring her about some anxieties, well, that's a win for me. And for me, I find that a perfectly reasonable adjustment, and I'm happy to do it. Okay, so moving on to formal training, in-house or commissioned. With training, there are some standard reasonable adjustments, allowing people to have access to any preparation materials in advance, letting people take things away, being available for questions afterwards, letting people know what will be happening in the training. It's things that you won't expect. So people with disabilities going into training events need to know when the breaks are. They need to know where the breaks are. They need to know whether they're going to be put on the spot and expected to talk in front of other people. If those things are part of your training, you need to let people know in advance and potentially give them a get-out clause. So I was running a training course recently, and there was a woman with autism on the course, and we had an agreement that she simply didn't have to speak in the group. And when there was small group breakout exercises, that was fine. But when it was a whole group of, a circle with people sitting, she didn't have to speak in the group. And I wouldn't do the thing where I went round one by one and made everybody give me an answer. I decided not to do that, to make that accommodation for her. And actually, by the end of the course, she was easily speaking in the group and she was having a great time. But she wasn't required to. And so thinking about adjustments in any kind of training that's being provided, and particularly in induction, one of the rules of thumb that I often give employers is that when you're employing someone with a disability, you very often need to put in a lot of upfront investment into that induction training. It might be more difficult, it's going to take a while. If you've got to get equipment in or technology or make changes to workstations, then that's going to take a while. If you're going to have to put in this extra input in making sure that instructions are understood and checking people's work, that's going to take a while. If you need coaching to look at specific areas of difficulty like memory, that might take a while. But what you get in return is an employee who's incredibly loyal, who isn't going anywhere, and who is unlikely to job hop, given the amount of investment that they have also put into getting this right in the first place. So, and there is actually sound scientific evidence to suggest that people with disabilities tend to have a longer tenure than people without disabilities. So that's a massive advantage for any employer, basically. And then environmental flexibility. And this sort of really plays into the workstation adaptations and the schedule flexibility, but thinking about the wider environment of the company and do they need to be in the office, but B, what is your office like? I keep seeing these offices where everybody's really into massive splashes of huge bright colours and really harsh white light, and just really being aware that for people with certain conditions, that's not going to be helpful. That bright light is very off-putting for people with neurodiversity. It can be overwhelming for people with mental health needs, with concentration difficulties. It might spark migraines, or it might be difficult. There's lots of reasons why the current fad of really shouty, loud office environments isn't necessarily disability conducive. But also, the absolute basics: do you have an access ramp? And do you have disabled access into your building? I was actually at a disability conference in Florida giving a talk earlier this year. And at the disability conference, there was a ramp down to the swimming pool from the hotel. So you could leave the hotel bar, you could go out, and then there was a ramped access to the swimming pool. But when you got to the bottom of the ramp, there was a gate, a locked gate, and to unlock it, I could only reach it by putting my hand above my head. So anybody in a wheelchair would get to the end of that ramp and then not be able to get through. And one of the things that we suggest in disability inclusion is, if you're going to put in things like this to your environment, then the best thing to do is to test it with people who are going to use it. There's a phrase in disability inclusion called "nothing about us without us." And if you've got stuff like that you're planning on putting in, then the best person to have that conversation with is somebody who is going to be using it. So getting other people, I recently went to TEDx in London, and I was invited to go by the Shaw Trust, and the woman from the Shaw Trust, Claire Gray, had invited people with a wide range of disabling conditions. So because she's been asked to give feedback to Queen Elizabeth Hall on their accessibility. So she wasn't just looking at wheelchair access, she was also looking at background noise, the availability of quiet space, sensory impairment. She was looking at a wide range, and we all had to go to this wonderful event so that we could then give her feedback, which reminds me I haven't done it yet, but I will. So at this point, does anybody have any questions about the types of reasonable adjustments? Anybody got anything they'd like to ask? I'm just going to stop the share and come back to
obviously you can use either the chat or the Q&A, whichever. Oh, I think someone has asked a question. No,
yeah.
no, we haven't got that. It's just David.
Anybody got any questions specifically about types of adjustment? Has this been helpful?
Sorry. Oh yeah, you're getting a few bit of feedback, sort of thing.
Good, good.
We've got something. What have you seen on workload for those with mental health challenges? This is
that's a really, really, really good question. Workload is a particular bone of contention in reasonable adjustments. And it kind of starts in education, where we start giving people 25% extra time to complete exams. And the issue is, if I am paying somebody £20,000 to deliver 100%, and I am paying somebody else £20,000 to deliver 70%, is that a reasonable adjustment? Is it fair on person A if I offer this to person B? I think if the only reasonable adjustment being required is a reduction in workload, there is a legal argument that that's not reasonable. If you're expecting to get paid the same for delivering less work than your colleagues, it's not necessarily reasonable. It might be reasonable as a temporary measure. It might be reasonable as part of a process. It might be reasonable as part of a managed return to work or a managed induction. But on a long-term, ongoing basis, it is not reasonable to ask an organisation to pay the same amount of money for somebody to do less work. And I think that's there is case law to support that. What we do have to do is make sure that that workload is manageable in terms of how that person is supported to deliver it. And my experience with mental health is quite a lot. And what I find in the mental health field is that people with mental health needs are getting great support from clinicians on mood, on managing anxiety. And an employer can help with that, like the example that I gave with my employee who has anxiety challenges. But what most clinicians miss is concentration. They're missing the thinking aspects and the cognitive aspects. Now, I mean, I've got contracts with several of the major banking groups. And what I can tell you, weirdly, those banking groups are some of the most forward-thinking organisations when it comes to reasonable adjustments. If you have a mental health need, or if you have a neurodiverse condition, they will provide you text-to-speech software, speech-to-text software. They'll make sure you're trained in using it. They don't just dump it on you and run. They give you good training. They will get you coaching on managing your executive functions in the workplace. They will allow you dual screens. They will allow you ear defenders. They will allow you to sit in an office. They will allow you to work from home if you can, but what they will not do is reduce your targets. They absolutely will not do that. And so I think what we have to look at is where is the challenge on workload coming from for that person with mental health? Is it coming from all of the environmental and workstation and schedule difficulties that are affecting them? By the time they get to work, they're so tense in the environment they're in, they're so tense. If they are capable of the job, if they are competent for the job role, it's actually the environment and the sensory changes that we can make that will support that individual to work at their best, rather than a reduction of workload. And the other thing is that if we take that option and that individual with mental health challenges is able to perform at the same level of their peers, that has a massive positive reinforcing effect on their self-esteem. People don't want to be felt sorry for. They don't want to be treated like a charity case. They want to feel valued and part of a team. And reducing the workload on a permanent basis, I think, could potentially have quite a negative impact on people's self-esteem as well. So it's a tricky one, that. And one of the reasons it's tricky is because we do it in the school system ubiquitously. You know, so the 25% extra time rule for exams is just, yeah, do it, 25% extra time, 25, and it works in that situation, because the exam condition itself isn't a reflection of the job role. If you're working in a call center, your job role is how quickly you do things, and 25% extra time in that context isn't appropriate. If your job role is having fruitful conversations in which you help somebody work out how to manage a child in a group home, then the time isn't relevant. And so you can assess somebody by talking with them, and there's no time boundness to that. Do you see what I mean? You've got to fit the adjustment to the job role. So if part of the workload is how quickly you manage stuff, then that's part of the workload, and it's not a reasonable adjustment to reduce targets or to reduce workload. Does that make sense?
Any other questions at all? I think positive sort of feedback. Oh yeah, you've got yeah.
Thank you, Tanya M. I'm glad you heard that. I mean, it's a difficult one to get across sometimes. People want to be given extra time. They want to be reduced in workload, but they also don't want to be a charity case, and they also want to be a valued member of the team. So I think, managed and staggered workloads on return to work and induction, those are fine, but long-term expectations that you do less than the person next to you that's being paid the same amount, that is not going to work long-term, and it's not going to help the team either. You only need someone to find out about that, and then we're going to start cycling through prejudice, discrimination, it's not fair, all of that stuff's going to start coming out, and the individual isn't going to be helped by that long-term. Okay, so keep coming with any more questions. Let's go back to sharing. And where am I? Okay, so now let's look at systemic policies and practice. And so I think from the examples I've given you, what I hope you can see is that there's a lot that an organisation can do before they even have to respond to an individual with a disability. You don't have to wait for there to be a problem before you can put things in. If you're mindful of scheduling, if you think about where people are sitting in relation to each other, if you think about how you deliver training and what kind of distractions are involved in your workplace, you can do all of those things. Employers can do all of those things before they take anybody on. And if part of your job role is to work with employers and to prepare them for disability employment, then those are the things that you can start talking about straight away. No one has to wait. You can just start thinking about them and just start doing them, and thinking about how can we adjust this as a business, and what any employer that you might be working with might need to be aware of is they probably already have people with disabilities working for them who are finding these things difficult. So not everybody discloses multiple sclerosis, not everybody discloses ADHD, not everybody discloses difficulties that they might be having. And so by paying attention to these sort of main four: schedules, workstation location, training, and environmental distraction, you can get ahead of the game and prevent your existing employees from having difficulty. And when you're working with your clients, I think it's really helpful for them to know that these are the kinds of things they can ask for. There's always this expectation, isn't there, that the disabled person will know what they need. And actually, I keep finding that they do. They know exactly what they need, but they don't know it's a reasonable adjustment to ask for it. So they know that they find it really stressful and unable, that they're compromised their concentration is compromised when the office is noisy or cold or really smelly at lunchtime with other people's food. They know that affects them, but they didn't know it was a reasonable adjustment for them to ask to sit somewhere else, come in late on a Tuesday, book out a meeting room. They didn't know it was a permissible thing. And so that's a really useful bit of training that you can give to people. So then when we start looking at personalised interventions, I'd like you to just remember the thing I told you right at the beginning about how all adjustments at the personal level, they still need to be things that the organisation is doing differently or facilitating. We're not in the business of changing people's brains or changing people's thinking in order to fit the needs of the job. That's not the law. The law is not that. So when we're looking at individual adjustments, well, assistive technology is the first one, and that has to be done at the individual level. You can't just apply assistive technology across the board. When I did a survey of all these different adjustment types, and assistive technology consistently came out as the least helpful, but mainly because people weren't trained to use it. So when people had assistive technology and had been trained to use it, then it came out as one of the most helpful adjustments. And this was directly conflicting with other research on assistive technology that was done with pools of students. And so I think there's a big difference between somebody in their 50s trying to learn to use a piece of technology that they've never come across. They've got used to doing something the same way their whole life, and now they're having to do something different. Or somebody with an acquired disability where they're used to being able to type, and they've been able to type for years, but now they're unable to use their hands. They've got arthritis, something's happened. And so, someone making a shift into assistive technology rather than someone who is kind of growing up with it and it's how they've always done it is a big difference. So although we do need that individual to change, and so we're in slightly difficult space here, but what we can do is support that individual to change and make sure that they have the training that they need to be able to use the technology well, and rather than just saying, here it is, get on with it. Because my research shows that doesn't work. Only 47% of people where that happened thought that assistive technology was helpful, compared to 95% of people thinking that it was helpful when they'd had sufficient training. And so then we're looking at the two coaching options. So coaching for literacy, coaching for time management and concentration and things like that. And this was actually the subject of my PhD thesis, was the validity of coaching as an adjustment activity, because it happens at the individual level. And what I found in my research is that coaching is an effective adjustment when it involves the line manager or supervisor. If you are using coaching as a black box in which you send somebody to go and be fixed, it's not a reasonable adjustment. If you are using coaching as an in-depth process whereby you're helping and empowering the individual to make continual adjustments to their workstation, to the flow of their work, to the way that they do things, then it is a reasonable adjustment. But that has to be a conversation between client and line manager. Lots of clients don't have the same level of self-awareness as to what they need in order to do their job properly. And this is something that I've come across repeatedly throughout my career, and it's particularly an issue for people with neurodiversity and mental health, actually. So they have a workplace needs assessment. The assessor only talks to the client, doesn't talk to the line manager or HR representative. The client says, oh, I'm really stressed, I'm finding it really hard to manage my deadlines. Okay, let's get you some coaching on time management, organisational skills and stress management. Fine. The coach then goes and delivers that. The line manager taps the coach on the shoulder one day and say, look, I'm lost here. I don't see how this is going to help, because actually what's going on is that I have to rewrite this woman's work for her. She's sending out letters from the National Health Service on behalf of consultants, and they're all full of spelling mistakes. They don't make sense. So, all this coaching that you're doing is all very well, but I don't see how it's going to help. And so what you've got is this massive disconnect between the task that the individual is being asked to do, what they think of their capabilities, and what is, these two things aren't marrying up. So the way that you make individual level coaching a reasonable adjustment activity is by making sure that the line manager is involved. Invite the line manager to the first session. Make sure that the line manager is bought into the priorities of the coaching. You know, is time management the biggest issue? Or actually, is it literacy? In which case, is coaching the right thing to do here? Should we be doing assistive technology? Making sure that these things are set up is the most important thing. But once you've got that coaching in place, if it is useful, then what you find is that the coach is able to work with individuals and come up with strategies that support them to be able to do their job well. What we do at Genius Within is we routinely re-offer coaching every time someone has a change of job role or a promotion, because what worked really well in this job might not work so well in the next job. And so it's worth making sure that people are aware that their reasonable adjustments need to come with them, but their reasonable adjustments might change. So it used to be that I was able to manage this office brilliantly, but now that I have to do court reports, actually that requires a level of detailed thinking that I can't manage in this environment anymore. Or it used to be that it was perfectly okay to be able to get on with my work without needing anyone to check in with me. But actually at the moment I need to check in on a more regular basis because this is going on. So reasonable adjustments come with, but they also may change over time. Okay. And then I think we've got about 9 minutes. So what I'd like to do is just talk to you about the different levels of disability inclusion, and then just have 5 more minutes for a few questions. So this is something that is very current in disability inclusion circles, and it's something that I'm talking about a lot when I'm doing speeches to sort of corporates about the disability inclusion talent agenda. And these are different types of inclusion. So exclusion is what's current. You know, whatever we might think and whatever we might read in the news, only 16% of people with autism have a job. 10% of the population are dyslexic, but 28% of people who are long-term unemployed are dyslexic. If you are in prison, 65% of people in prison have ADHD. People with mental health needs, the disability employment gap is incredibly low. You know, we are in a world of exclusion, and people with disabilities are more likely to be excluded from the workplace. Compliance-based inclusion is when we look at individuals and we buffer around those individuals. So we make particular adjustments for this person, but we don't think widely about our organisation. So we don't think about, well, actually, do we need a flexible working policy that anybody can, or is it just for that person? Okay, so Roger, it's just for you. We'll be flexible for you, but no one else. So we're making the individual the focus of the adjustments. And that's compliant, it's legally compliant with the law. And through compliance-based inclusion, we've learned a lot about how to respond to individual needs. So it's been a helpful part of the journey. Where we're coming to now in the UK in particular is this idea of deliberate inclusion. So like the chap that I told you about in Washington who had deliberately recruited people with visual impairment because their hearing acuity was enhanced for call centre work. Like people in GCHQ have recruited a group of dyslexic problem solvers because they think differently. Like Microsoft are deliberately recruiting people with autism to do accurate coding. So we know that there are these pockets of deliberate inclusion happening. And some people in disability fields are saying things like, well, that's still otherizing. We're still putting people in a box over there. We're not having them systemically included. And I think that's a valid point. But what I would also counter is that 10 years ago, no one thought it was cool. Nobody thought it would be cool to include people with disabilities. So the fact that we are now deliberately doing this, I think, again, is progress. So by mixing deliberate inclusion and compliance-based inclusion together, what we might end up with, hopefully, if we all do our jobs well in the next 10 to 20 years, is systemic inclusion. And so systemic inclusion is kind of turning things up on its end. So at the moment, the compliance approach is this. We wait for an individual to have problems, we make a diagnosis, we do a workplace need assessment, and then we respond to that need. We don't let that conversation go external to that person. We just think about that individual. If we're doing systemic inclusion, then we can be flexible in our system. We can have flexible working policies. We can consider the environment that we're in. We can have certain technology available as standard. So one of the things that Genius Within is a disability confident leader. And one of the things that we offer is a range of adjustments to everybody at interview and induction. So we don't wait for there to be a problem. What we say is, here are some things we've done before. So we have spent 30 minutes discussing the interview structure with people before. Is that a reasonable adjustment that you would like? We routinely offer assistive technology. Is that a reasonable adjustment that you would like? We routinely offer coaching for executive functions. Is this a reasonable adjustment that you would like? And so by offering the adjustment, rather than asking, do you have a disabling condition, what we're doing is showing people that our motivation for this question is to provide the support rather than to tick our box. And we're showing people that those adjustments are already in the system, they're already happening. The other thing we do is we offer work sample tests instead of interviews. If what we need is people, we're recruiting for someone in finance at the moment, that the job, the interview won't be waiting on the quality of interpersonal communication solely. We will also be looking at the technical details. So we'll be giving this person a work sample task and saying, let's see how quickly and accurately you do that, because that's the most important part of the job. The most important part of the job is knowing their way around an Excel spreadsheet and being able to predict operational concerns using numbers as the data that you're analysing. And so that will make sure that our HR recruitment processes match the job that we're trying to create. Within one-to-one reviews, we also build in reasonable adjustment questions. So in every one-to-one and every 6-monthly role review, people are asked the question, here's some reasonable adjustments we've provided before, is this something that would be useful for you? We don't need to go into confidentiality, we don't need to know, we don't need to ask if you've been diagnosed with something, we don't need to know what your condition is, we just need to say, here are some adjustments, have you thought about these? We personalise those adjustments, and then I think, something that employers and employees and, potential employees really need to know is it's okay to stop. There is a point where it doesn't matter how many reasonable adjustments you throw at the situation, this person is never going to fit into this environment or this job role. And it doesn't help anybody to pretend that's not the case. We do 1-year follow-ups at Genius Within, and 90% of our clients are still in work a year later. And when I started collecting that data, I was like, oh, 90%, why isn't it 100%? Why isn't it 95%? And I started talking to coaches and assessors. And what I found out is that the 10% of people who aren't still working in the same job a year later, and actually 25% get promoted within a year as well. So that's an even better stat. But that 10% that are leaving because they're just not in the right job. And one of the things that can come out of a coaching session is that the coach starts looking at the job role and the client and starts going, all right, it doesn't matter what we do here, this might never work. So instead, let's talk to this client about where would you like to be in 3 years' time? Where would you like to be in 5 years' time? And then start looking at career steps rather than trying to get this person to fit into the proverbial square hole if they are a round peg. And kind of just having that conversation be productive, formative, respectful, not ending up in discrimination. Those things are positive outcomes. So we have to agree it's okay to stop. And within the law, it is okay to stop. Employing somebody with a disability does not mean you can't performance manage them. It just means that if you're going to performance management, you have to make sure that you've done your due diligence first and put in place reasonable adjustments as far as is reasonably practicable, given the resources of the organisation, the size of the organisation, the flexibility of the job tasks. If you've done everything you can and that person still isn't performing, it's not fair on anyone to keep them in that job. It's not going to help their self-esteem. It's not going to help their long-term career outcomes. Large companies can consider moving people. So there we go. That's the end of my little rant, and I shall leave you with disability inclusion is a moral, social and economic imperative we all lose when human potential is squandered. So just at that point,
Any more questions from anybody? Nancy, while we're waiting, that last point you were making about performance managing sort of people, how difficult is it to make that judgment, sort of that someone just isn't right for a job? You know, is that a subjective judgment almost, when you've done everything you think you could have done in terms of reasonable adjustments?
I think if you've got to the point where you're going to you know, consider performance management, or which may end up in dismissal, then you need to get somebody in to check. That's the kind of thing that Genius, that's the sort of service that Genius Within should provide and would provide. I think getting expertise from outside the organisation is the right thing to do at that point. Because I mean, it's something that I've been asked to do many times, is review the reasonable adjustments that have been made for somebody and answer the question, is there anything else we could have done? I mean, at the end of the day, only an employment tribunal can make that final decision, but as due diligence as an employer, you want to get that checked before you do anything serious.
Sure. Sorry, hijacking that. Is there, participants, any more questions or comments for Nancy via the chat or the Q&A? Stand by. I think we're at sort of 1 o'clock, sort of, Nancy.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to have that conversation, Roger. Oh, got one flashing up. Very informative. Thank you, Nancy. My pleasure. So it's always nice to get a bit of feedback in the way. Thank you all for having me. Coming.
Sorry, if it's okay, Nancy, we can share the slides, but we've also recorded the webinar. There are people that couldn't get on. I know there was at least one person who's having sound problems, but I think that was their end rather than our end. In this case. But thank you so much. That was fascinating. And we've got a face-to-face version, I think, in the new year. We're doing a get to grips session, so we'll make sure that's well publicised. Thank you so much, Nancy.
All right. Thanks, Roger. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.